everybody, and welcome to Invoking the Healer Summit, where we are showcasing spotlights on therapists, clinicians, and spiritual leaders in the field of different embodiment and spiritual and clinical practices. And there's no better time than to talk about why we need to incorporate new and emerging modalities, simply because we know that the older ones don't always get us the results that we're looking for. And there's no better person than for me to introduce you today. One of my personal mentors and someone I collaborate with and I learn from, and that is Dr. Jess Hanson, who has always been interested in human connection and healing that happen when one's heart's open. And Jesse, I have to say, has also been a real true mentor in the Toronto community as well, because he comes from California and he brought his emergence of his teachings to Toronto and rallied the Toronto healing community. And for that, I really am grateful, and so is everybody else. Jesse holds a PhD in clinical psychology, specializing in somatic psychology and neuropsychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and a master's degree in clinical psychology from Santa Barbara, California. In addition to his academic pursuits, he spent over 18 years training with esteemed holistic and shamanic teachers, and he has explored the ancient ways through meditation, ceremony, ritual, and the modern through psychoneurobiology and quantum physics. These experiences fostered a realization that the language, however different, bears the same truth: the union of mind and body induces a surreal natural evolution. Jesse is also a psychotherapist in Midtown Toronto, and he was a previous clinical director of Helix Healthcare in Toronto. And it was the first of its kind where we integrated neuroscience, somatic psychology, and other clinical proved interventions in a multifaceted approach to providing unique and personalized treatment for his clients. It was a perfect incubator for Jesse to further develop his own clinical practice, fostering leadership skills, and explore a multidisciplinary of media and group presentations. And I could go on about Jesse, but I really want to get into the conversation, not to shortchange him with anything about his academics. But when I think of you, Jesse, I think of you as such a spiritual leader, not just for myself, but for so many in this field, where you opened our eyes to another way of healing. I think, we always knew that when we talk about going to a therapist, or we talk about seeing or we need some support or help, we think that that's created equal. And I know we bring our own individual nuances to the process, but you took it from a completely revolutionary process. So can you just tell our listeners today a little bit of how you work and the work that you do, please?
Absolutely. No. First and foremost, thanks so much, Jen, for having me on here, and believe in your work, and so happy you're building this forum. Especially you built it before COVID. We in discussions long ago, and now that COVID culture is here, it's even more appropriate. So I'm happy to be here. And yeah, I mean, it's a big launching point there. I'll just say that in a nutshell. I mean, I think one of the main reasons that I have some of the gifts I have, or learned what I've learned, is because for so many years, or roughly 7 years before I got into the clinical world, I studied not only spiritual and Eastern mysticism, but also native indigenous teachings and practices that helped me wake up so much to realize, wow, like so much more healing can happen through embodiment and movement and understanding the mind-body connection. And then I got, in my late 20s, early 30s, tried to get indoctrinated into the normal clinical academia. And because I had such a strong base of more embodied indigenous, and I don't mean just indigenous like Native American, but I mean indigenous to who all of us are as humans on the planet. We come into this planet as young ones that we have a body, and our mind is not even organized yet. We don't even have language. And so as we grow, many of us become addicted to the mind, and many of the existing structures and healing systems are so mental. And as you've learned as well as I have, once you bring in embodiment to the healing practices, it takes everything to another level. So I think if it's okay with you, what I would like to do is just take a few minutes on trauma and embodiment as terms and themes.
I was just going to ask you that, so it's perfect, because I think they're sometimes buzzwords that people don't always really understand how they apply and what it really means to them. So definitely, please do.
Beautiful, cool. And then I think once those two things are discussed for a few minutes each, then it would be an even more satisfying answer to about what is the work and how do we do the work, etc. Right? So I think let's start with trauma. This is probably the most confused one, the most commonly confused. And what I would say quickly is the myth is that trauma is physical or sexual assault, car wrecks, and war. Those are absolutely traumatic experiences, but that is not what trauma is, and that is not all that expounds on trauma. One of my favorite sayings to help people try to break through the old way of thinking and seeing is to realize trauma is not a noun, it is a phenomenon. So we want to say, oh, that event was traumatic, that thing, that person, that hit, that whatever was trauma. No, that is not accurate in the most common, the most modern neuroscience and psychology, and I would say even outside of academia, when we access a certain place in our consciousness with full accountability for creating our world, the phenomenon of trauma is a relationship between me, my nervous system, and whatever the heck's going on around me. So it is, I'll repeat it one more time, it's not a noun, it's a phenomenon. It's a experience. That is why, if you haven't seen it already, there's ample research out there that shows 35 people can go through the exact same thing, and only 3 of them exhibit the symptoms of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning they related to that event in a way that really hurts, and their body's holding on to memories, whereas everyone else experienced it in a way that was probably uncomfortable, but because they knew about how to let go in a different way, or maybe they practiced embodiment or meditation or something, they didn't pick up the traumatic experience from the same event.
And the safety, there could be some safety issues around,
Exactly.
is one feel contained or not? So I appreciate that. And I just want you to expand on one thing around trauma, and that is they often say sometimes not to minimize significant events such as war and abuse of any kind or violence, but there's reference to the fact that trauma is not so much what happened, it's what happens afterwards, or the lack of something happening in order to support that person. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And yeah, so there was 2 main pieces of the trauma. One, we covered quickly there, that it's really more of a phenomenon. It's a relational experience.
Mm-hmm.
In the nerdy academic world, we call this interpersonal psychoneurobiology. It means how I'm interacting between, most trauma happens with other people, even if it's a car wreck or whatever. You say it's the car, yeah, but there was a driver, right? So it's a way of looking at how our own human interactions with other people, as well as events of the world, create the traumatic experience, but that no single event is the actual trauma. The trauma is that relational place between me and the event. The other one, to your point, is that another misconception is that, or lack of understanding, is that there are really, clinically speaking, there are 2 distinct forms of trauma.
Okay.
Acute, which is more physical, which is what the main ones that we named already, meaning that, and just for people to take it in, the scientific definition of trauma is roughly stated as dysregulated nervous system. So it's not about having to be hit. It's not about it. It's really anytime the nervous system gets dysregulated, it's in a trauma response. How much we know how to navigate that and re-regulate ourselves and come back to center will determine whether or not we accrue PTSD or trauma residue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in physical and acute trauma, that what distinguishes acute trauma is that there is a physical impact to the body, right? So that could be obviously physical sexual assaults, but even just, wrecks, whatever it is, accidents, etc. And the other one is called developmental or attachment trauma, which is what I believe every single person on the planet has, because these are where you get into themes of neglect and hypervigilance of parents, for example, or partners. But in other words, either too much or too little attention, and with repeated imprinting to the nervous system, meaning that happens over and over again. The child who's repeatedly neglected, they have just as severe, if not more severe, trauma symptoms than the person who's been in a crazy car wreck or something only physical. So the science shows, the psychology shows, my understanding as a human and a therapist shows, it is not fair to judge ourselves or other around whose trauma is worse or better, what counts, what doesn't. Anyone that has had a dysregulated nervous system knows what trauma feels like, and there are magnitudes, so I honor those magnitudes as well. But that, attachment trauma and acute or physical trauma are the distinguishing markers that we often overlook, and people say, I don't have trauma. but we do.
Well, I think it's definitely misunderstood, in even terms of a dysregulated nervous system. And you talked about attachment trauma, and I think that is another gross misconception, that typically we may appear as adults in relationship, but often the child is standing there with their attachment needs not being met. And this is what happens in relationships. And somebody thinks this is very logical, like, why isn't he getting it? Why doesn't she understand? But the adult's offline at that point. there's a little child there who has some very specific needs. And it's really like, this work really needs to be brought forward, because I believe so many relationships could be saved if people really understood just something as simple as that, on how our interpersonal relationships can either be fragmented even further, or they could be actually healed and brought together, right?
So well said, Jen. And so to me, that encapsulates like the quick theory of trauma. Let's take a few minutes on embodiment, and then I'd love to dive in with you in terms of, from a therapeutic approach part, how do we really work with these themes in the therapy offices or the coaching
Absolutely.
offices. So embodiment, in a few minutes or less, is the ment of coming into the body, right? And again, coming in from science first, then into more soulful language, bihemispheric brain activity, getting the left and right brain to talk to each other, to be able to have the corpus callosum flowing like an infinity sign of information back and forth, is essentially all of our goals as humans. When we have that brain activity, we feel better, our body operates more smoothly. And so with embodiment, what is usually happening is that the right brain is not only creativity, music, and feelings, and the left brain being analytical and thought-provoking and all that. It's that the right brain is more connected with sensory motor experiences, which means movement, touch, feelings, emotions, and the left brain is almost like an organizer of all of that.
Okay.
And so this happens first. Doesn't mean it's better, doesn't mean it's stronger, just means it's primary. So if we can honor that there's a primeness, and just means prime means one or first, then everything in the left brain is a reaction or a response or a relationship to what's happening in the right brain. And with embodiment, what happens is people accidentally, unconsciously suffocate their own right brain by becoming hyper intelligent, hyper functional, hyper cognitive behavioral therapy, hyper anything that is just left brain oriented will essentially smother that right brain, which means, I don't really know what I feel, or I don't know how to control my feelings if I do feel, right? Living from the head up. Very, very dangerous place to live in terms of having a quality life. Many people know that even if they've acquired a lot of money through their left brain powers, money does not guarantee happiness. So embodiment is really learning how to have a bihemispheric brain, which means there are specific practices both in the ancient yogic traditions as well as the modern neuroscience. All these things are ways that we can bring it to life. I believe that each person is unique and beautiful. And I've had people that find out that, building something in their garage is their embodiment practice because they're able to sync up in a certain way. So I'm not so rigid as to say you can only get it through meditation and yoga. Those are the most common ones, are the most probably direct. But it's really about realizing I need to have a connection to my body that is not just thinking of it as a machine that I have to take care of or abuse, but that realizing my body and my mind work together as one to be able to create the quality of consciousness that I have. And that quality of consciousness will determine whether or not I enjoy my life and my relationships of all forms.
Beautiful. I in a personal way, I understand embodiment in a very real way, because, and I'm sure a lot of people who come to you, whether they think they need to work on something, they come for they have no idea what they're coming for, but they know that they need some support. And typically what happens is that what their way of adapting, typically as a child, if you come from a survival environment with adverse childhood experiences, you're going to adapt and you go into survival mode. And survival mode may mean got to look after everybody else, got to take care of myself. I got to figure out, you know, you can navigate and intuitively know who's dangerous, what's safe, right? And so those are good skills when you're younger, but they actually become your demise as you're older. And that was my experience. Like, I had very good survival instincts from my, you know, my childhood, knowing how to navigate and keep myself safe and out of trouble. But when you're regulating so high, you're over functioning and you're just sort of disconnected from the head up, it comes to a point where it just brought me to my knees, that I knew I needed something different. And that was to bring my body into the equation, which I had never done because I learned to disconnect because of my history. And so, you know, that is the way home for a lot of us. And it may feel so uncomfortable, but if there's anybody who feels so strange here, I was a person who really couldn't cry. Like, I was frozen even in my dad's funeral. And now I'm just there's so much access there now that never could have been through doing this work. So I really encourage you to just sort of be open to what is, because this is where the healing, when the mind, body, and spirit really, truly integrate, and we come home to ourselves. So I just wanted to add that. So thank you.
Beautifully said. I love the language of it is feel like a homecoming. And you know, like you said, it's well worth the investment of time, energy, money that any of us need to put in to shift, because as most of us come to be aware of this, we are in our adult bodies with our adult minds and all of our adult experiences and memories. And so it's something most of us do have to reprogram. And even though I've known this for 20 years, it is a daily practice, because partly I think that it's safer in the mind in a general sense. Like, it's, you know, we don't have to feel as much. But also, I think it's important to name that, you know, we do live in a culture and a society that has conditioned us quite well and made it quite easy to avoid the body and live in the mind. And so I think the more of us that wake up to this and just want to have embodiment for their own quality of life, the better off this planet's going to be. So I think that, to me, that sums up trauma and embodiment well enough for our purposes today. And do you want to then take maybe a few minutes to look at some methodology or how this is applied?
Yeah, absolutely. But I wanted to add that one of the things when we're talking about integration, which is really what we're talking about here, is to really, we want to be evaluating all the inputs, whether it's, what are we feeding our mind? Are we watching, you know, crime on TV or porn, or do we speak the language of embodiment? What are we ingesting in terms of nutrition? What is our body telling us physically? Like, there's information there, even in, you know, our hormones, our functions, our blood levels, etc. So really looking at this as a real, true, holistic approach is where we get the optimum function. And I look at, you just look at yourself, and I haven't seen you in a few months, and I go, oh my God, you look so healthy. Because yeah, you're taking care of yourself. You're nurturing yourself in every aspect of the way. And that's why some of us look like we're just worn out and dragging our ass, or some of us look like we're really come to, you know, we're healthy and thriving. So I just wanted to mention that before you jump in on anything else. So thank you.
No, beautifully said again, Jen. And I agree, it does. There are a lot of variables that play into our appearance and our overall feeling. And yet I agree, I think embodiment is one of the largest ones that is overlooked so quickly in our modern society.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would love to take a few minutes on how this all sinks in, especially whether or not the listeners are clinicians or therapists, or whether they are people that perhaps are interested in
seekers,
learning how to do this more. Is that I would offer quickly that if anyone wants to follow along, what I can do in the next few minutes is just kind of go through the what I've called right now the Hanson Healing Method. And that's on the website hansonhealing.com. I believe it's under the About tab, but if anyone wants to see that, I've done my best to take something that is very intuitive, spiritual, energetic, and make it a bit more left-brained and make it a bit more organized so that people can assimilate it easier. I know for me too, the more I've gotten the neuroscientific understanding of how and why all this stuff works, the less I have to fight my own ego, and the less I have to fight my own defense mechanisms to get out of the way. So that's the goal of why that's published on the website. And that's what I'll reference now for quick, easy access. And step one, redefining the sense of self. And it's exactly what we've been talking about, you just said it beautifully, having to look at what language am I using? What am I doing? how do I see myself?
Mm-hmm.
And basically, in a nutshell, though it would take much longer than we have today to go deep into it, it's really realizing that we are mind, body, spirit, that we are spirit being scientifically defined as electromagnetic energy that drives the heartbeat as well as other body functions in the limbic and different, the endocrine system, many different systems in the body are powered by this magical force that, many hyper left brain people don't want to believe in any greater power or anything like that. Religion aside, just to recognize we do have the science now that quantum physics and neuroscience lets us measure electromagnetic frequencies that actually animate the body.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's having to really get over ourselves, I believe, and get over this idea that, we're just a mind or we're just small in some way, and realize we're all incredibly expansive, multidimensional beings, that we are part consciousness, we are part mind, and we are part brain body. And mind and consciousness are not the same thing. Mind is where thoughts come from. It's how I figure things out and analyze. Consciousness has the ability to experience and hear language like words,
Mm-hmm.
whether those are messages, or to experience the thoughts, much like meditation teaches us. However, consciousness is also encompasses all body experiences and all subtle memories and subtle things that a lot of us look over. So that's what I would argue is step one. If we don't have that within us, we're going to be salmon swimming upstream the rest of the way through these steps. And there are so many ways, and often in my practice, it will only take me oftentimes many people come already awakened and understanding this. If they don't, it can take a few sessions to help them understand it and break through maybe some mental blocks. But let's assume that we move through that and we've reorganized our sense of self and we come to our ownership that we're multidimensional beings, and that there are many versions of us, including the younger traumatized selves. So now step two is about building the tribe, or organizing all of that information so that it can become workable like clay,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just a concept or something I can talk about.
Okay.
And step two in building the tribe, it's a lot through guided imagery, mindfulness, some conversation, but it's being able to take ownership that there's an apparently normal part of who I am. And within this Dr. Jesse Hanson, there is the doctory part, there is the inner child playful part, there's the angry part that comes out still from time to times, there's the sad part that feels lonely, as we all do. It's about really organizing and understanding not only who makes us up inside, but also why. Why are certain characters, if you could call them such, why are they our go-tos? Why is it that every time my husband says this to me that way, I immediately snap back at him in a certain voice? Or why do I shrink away? Right? These are not our true selves. These are versions of us taking over. And from the neuroscience world, they are neural networks. They are different parts of the brain body that fire together and wire together. And so we operate like this. And yet many of us don't understand that and don't know how to work with it. So
I
step two,
love the way you say they're characters.
they
They are characters.
we all have these crazy characters in us, and the goal of being a more conscious person means starting to take ownership for those. And so let's assume now that a person has redefined sense of self. They've now started to build the tribe or understand the different versions of self and how they operate and why.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say particularly I'm now able to realize that these specific childhood or developmental memories have a lot to do with why I show up like this in 2020 or beyond. Then step three is about the reprocessing. And it really is the heart of this work, and really is what distinguishes this work from most, if not everything else that's out there. I'm now going to be roughly citing Bessel van der Kolk's work, Pat Ogden's work, different EMDR therapies. All these things are now out there already, clinically legitimized, very well studied. And in a nutshell, Jen and listeners, it is reprocessing trauma means being able to move it through the nervous system in a way that it no longer is held. And when it's held, it causes us to do dysfunctional things. And when it's released and flowed, we can have a more embodied experience of who we really are, which is, of course, the calm, the loving, the peaceful parts of us. And
the grace, just to feel alive and conscious, right?
And if, I'll say the fourth one quickly, and if you want to, we could take a little bit more. I'd also love to hear if you're open to sharing anything, what you've learned too. And step 3 is the work that you and I have adventured in together as well, and learning how to release through the body, and assuming that we're brave enough to do that and learn how to let go. And this is where the therapeutic guidance and support is so crucial. Then the last step is integration, which is pretty simple. It just means, now that I have this upgrade, now that I'm not carrying around this big chunk of past, not just in my mind, but in my body too, it's released. How do I take this new version, Jen 7.0, how do I take her back into the life that Jen 2.0 built, right? Or Jesse 2.0 or
Yeah,
whatever. So
that
that's
is
the
a
last
challenge.
stage. And that can be a little less somatic or body oriented and more mental. So it's almost like starting in the mind, diving down deeper into the body, and then resurfacing back to the mind or the left brain. That's the rhythm, and it's an algorithm, and I share it freely and openly because I want everyone on the planet to get it and wake up. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying any of us can do it on our own, but I do know for myself, and now tens of thousands of clients, they've seen amazing shifts. And becoming your own best therapist, become your own best healer. Don't look to
Which
me or Jen or
Invoking
anyone,
the healer, which is what this is all about.
right?
We have it within us.
And that method, if we can learn it, we have to repeat it over and over again with different traumatic events of our past, as well as things that will happen as life goes on. And yet it's a way to not be perfect, because none of us can, but to be a human being that lives with a open flowing nervous system, and from the east, an energetic chakra system that moves energy up and down through all of the hands for love. That everything becomes a more real and sacred way to live life, rather than running around in our head forever.
Like those rats. So there's so much you just said there. I just wanted to really talk about how this work is really accessible for people, because I think for me personally, I had never had a safe experience being held in a way, emotionally, sometimes physically as well, and spiritually, where there was clinicians who are able to support you in a very safe way so that you can repattern your feelings, which are very emotionally charged, in a safe way that doesn't re-injure ourselves. So in our relationships, we play that out, and then we walk away disappointed because often that our needs are not met because we're not interacting effectively, or that character is showing up again, some part of ourself that's interfering with the process. So I think that is really has been the heart of it all for me, is that I didn't realize, like, I had parents who loved me, so I thought it was all good, right? But when you recognize that you've lived on your mind, and your mind and your body are like really, separate and not integrated at all, and then you have given the chance to really be held safely and be seen and validated, and you can have this positive experience of that, that's where the magic happens and the healing really begins. And it was something that probably most of us don't know we're missing until we dive into this work, right? Because we're really getting our needs met, and maybe what we were given was not what necessarily we needed. And this is not a blame thing. It's just like it takes a lot of skill and understanding to know that. But I did want to really talk about why this work is so overlooked. And, I know you come from academia, you also are very spiritual, and you're also very progressive in how you work. But why do you think some of these newer modalities, like, we're talking about trauma right now, and it's taken some time for it to become mainstream. And still, like, I see it in different sectors in hospitals, for example, it's still rejected. They still want to go CBT. They still feel that is like the ultimate, way of healing. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are around that.
Great point. And I'll say, I do have respect for CBT, and it does have a place in the therapeutic world. However, in the treatment of trauma, it really doesn't even make sense scientifically to think that through CBT you can really reprocess unconscious material that is stored much deeper than what CBT can access. So I hear you on that, and I agree. And I think it's about honoring it and knowing where it fits in, and then also knowing where more is needed. So I think that the simplest answer to your question, why have these types of treatments been avoided or not accepted yet in so much of the existing systems in the world? The easiest answer is fear, collective fear. I cannot tell you how many times, I will not name universities to be respectful, but very, very large universities when I lived and worked in Los Angeles, big names universities there that I would have internship hours with, and we would do groups. And so it was me from this more progressive neuroscience school and then them from these big name schools. And as soon as people would bring up anything to do with trauma or anything where the therapist was uncomfortable,
Yes.
they would shut it down, or they would use a CBT kind of technique to say, yeah, but what about if you just remember you really are a good person and just focus on that.
Think your way out of it, right? When your
So
body's telling you something else, right?
I really believe that the number one reason is a collective unconscious fear present in almost all humans. And again, that human beings as a collective consciousness across time, ancient times, there was so much more embodiment. Daily life involved movement. And if we didn't move in certain ways, we didn't survive. If we didn't hunt and gather, if we didn't farm well, if we didn't do what we needed done. Now today we have so many, as technological evolution has happened and the industrial revolution happened, the embodiment lessened because all of a sudden machines are doing everything and everything's just convenient and easy. So that's why I said earlier, culture forced us up into our head, and yet we are also the ones that created the culture collectively. And I know there are very many hierarchies and ways in which culture is created, but that's a different talk. But my point is, I think it's not necessarily about trying to point fingers at any one doctor or organization. It's more recognizing, as humanity, we have devolved from a bihemispheric perspective. We've evolved from technology. We've evolved from machinery's perspective. But in terms of looking at what the human brain has been going through across time, we've become less functional in terms of having more of the brain light up, and we've become more functional in terms of having primarily frontal cortex and left brain features light up. So there's a collective fear we're all working against. And I think the only last thing I'll quickly say on that, Jen, is that, like I mentioned there in my personal example, when it's messier to be in the body and to let emotions happen. It's much easier to just cognitively, behaviely, reroute.
Well, the ego's out of the way, right?
Right. Yeah.
So now you're really online.
Exactly, right. At least the ego's getting out of the way. And so I think that's what we're looking at. And that's where I've done all this work in the academic world to become educated enough to be able to speak both languages, because I think that's what's needed is education. I think more people need education about what really is trauma, what is embodiment, how do we work with trauma as a whole, as a community, as a team of humans. And yet we're still so far because, and also, again, we'll touch on this just gently, the whole psychopharm industry has a big reason as to why these are not accepted treatments, because you can actually help people truly cure their issues rather than numbing them and then numbing them again with another cocktail, right? So I think there's a lot of reasons why we see it, and that's part of, I think, your work, my work. Many people are waking up to realize, and it really does come back at a human level of regaining power, regaining a sense of not dominating abusive power, but a sense of self, a sense of empowerment at a soul level, at a core level, that I don't need to give my power away to medications that numb it. I can actually reclaim my power. I just have to go through some intense waves of emotion to be able to clear it and therefore get myself back.
Beautiful. Yeah. It's interesting, like part of the work of the Recovery Concierge is really, it started for really out of innovation of what didn't exist, and people were really confused as to how to get on a pathway to some sort of wholeness, whether it was mental health, addictions, whatever. But I really see a very clear need to even understand what kind of therapist I need and when, what kind of treatment plan do I need if I'm struggling with all these different areas in my life, whether they're patterns or just negative thoughts and beliefs, and they're in some sort of sabotage, and they want to move forward in some way. People often go to therapists or a marriage counselor or a couples therapy or EMDR or whatever it may be, without being able to discern what really their specialty is or what they need or what the timing is of it all. And so I feel like, because language is confusing. If I say the term recovery or mental health or EMDR or therapist, it may mean 100 different things to different people. So I feel like there is a real need to really understand, you know, how do we move forward in the best way so that we're not wasting time, we're not feeling defeated, we're not wasting resources, like whatever it is that we're doing, if we have to throw money at this to get well, that people come out and have this incredible holistic transformational experience, right? Which is what it's really about. And so, yeah, I see a need for that now. You mentioned, you talked about education more than ever, because there's just so much misinformation, I think, in mental health, because it is so damn nuanced, right? People really don't understand how nuanced it really is. And that's why I'm passionate about the work I do, for that reason. And I think if I didn't have so much good lived experience, I wouldn't know any of this stuff, right? It's just because I've come through it and I found resilience, thank God, after all these years. So
I often say that, you know, my real work has been all of my own personal development work. That's my actual PhD. I had to jump through the hoops of the system to get those credentials, but it you know, if anything, going through all that academic rigmarole has made me a worse therapist. And I had to earn my therapeutic skills back after I finished, because there was so many years of having be forced into my head from research and academia and all that. It's so heady that getting away from that again and getting back into the real healing process, it is about embodiment and bihemispheric brain activity. And like you said, really coming to, and even if people have spiritual hangups or religious hangups, I still believe people can do a lot around shifting their paradigm, their sense of self, that whole 4-step method. Even if you can just come to acknowledge your mind and body are separate, separate yet interconnected, indubitably and inevitably, and it is impossible to disconnect them. But yet so many of us want to live as if they're disconnected, whether we're always up in our head and avoiding the body, or whether we think we're taking care of our body because we're eating well and going to yoga and doing all these things, but we're still avoiding our emotions. Guess what? That emotional avoidance is creating a biochemical cocktail of its own, and your best drug dealer ever is the brain. So that dealer up there is dealing out all sorts of biochemical cocktails that are countering all of the good work you're doing with diet and exercise, if emotions are not honored as part of the equation, right? So, and then if you have the capacities to add in spirituality or understanding a greater power that makes the heartbeat beat in these bodies, then I think you can really expedite and elevate how the brain, body, and mind heals even quicker, right? So I think it's just a beautiful time for people to become more conscious, because we're all being faced with such fear, such suppression energy right now in the universe. So I hope this message lands well with everyone. And I'm grateful, Jen. I do have commitments as a daddy right now that I do have to roll to. I know we're not done by any means, but
we're never done. We're always in process. Okay, so I'll ask you one question, since you're a daddy, before you go. So what do you think some of the biggest challenges the next generation, the younger generation, are going to face?
Oh, almost makes me want to cry.
Oh. Education, right? People like us as a collective, making sure that we spread the light in that respect.
Probably the best motivator for any of us that are in any sort of resonance with you and I to do the work right now and help people. Because I mean, look at, not only technology is only moving faster and taking kids further out of their body at a younger age and more into the screen. So reducing screen time is awesome. But in a general sense, that's a minimal band-aid at best, because as soon as they have freedom, they're going to be driven back to that screen by every aspect of culture. And especially with the kids that are growing up right now in COVID, wow, the amount of fear, the amount of teaching about separation consciousness and how everyone is to be feared. I think this generation right now has probably more challenges than I've seen in a while. And so that's why we got to keep our work going and help ease that load for them, and hopefully make bigger systemic changes in the health field so that they can have more awareness from a young age about all this stuff. I mean, I can't believe that I went through all these boring classes on algebra and, you know, calculus and history and geography and all these things that I look back just as like, I didn't need any of that. I wish someone for once just kind of sat me down and said, you are mind and body. You know,
Yeah,
you as a child, like, you've got to learn how to live in your body. If you don't, you know, just any education would have been so helpful from a young age, but it's also, again, devoid. And we separate in our schools too, right? It's like physical exercise is only for PE. The rest of the day, you're in your head crunching numbers or regurgitating facts. And so I think those are the challenges they face. And I think we've said, well, what we got to do to help them. And beauty is it helps us too.
absolutely. Absolutely. So
So,
Jesse, I want to thank you so much for your time today, your voice, your vision, your passion around this work, because I share it with you. And I'm just so grateful for your attendance today and sharing your message and being part of my own mentorship community. So thank you again. And where can people find you?
easiest way is just my website right now is hansonhealing.com. And
Excellent.
it's just, yeah, HANSON healing, what we all want to be doing.com. And reach out. Love to hear any messages. And I'll continue to be updating that site with content as we go into the winter and virtual becomes even more
Absolutely.
important.
Okay, so thank you again, Jesse, and we will speak in really soon for us anyway. So thank you.
Hey, I'm so grateful, Jen. Thank you for doing what you do and keep it going.
I will, absolutely. Changing systemic systems, right?
Yes, everybody.